The spiked chastity belt represents one of the most perverse distortions of bodily and moral control in the Middle Ages. Unlike milder examples or romanticized myths about chastity belts, this cruel version had a single clear purpose: to turn an object supposedly meant to protect virtue into an instrument of constant pain, humiliation, and physical harm. The device was designed to restrict sexuality while simultaneously punishing, mutilating, and keeping the body in a perpetual state of threat. The basic design combined a rigid metal frame fitted to the torso and pelvis with a frontal plate covering the genital area. Inside this plate were spikes, short nails, or tiny blades pointing inward, touching the skin, or slightly penetrating it when the wearer moved. The belt was closed and sealed with a lock, sometimes reinforced with leather or straps to prevent easy removal. In more brutal versions, serrated surfaces or small movable blades would tear the flesh with each step or motion. Usage varied depending on the goals of the person imposing it. In contexts of social control or preserving reputation, the belt might be applied to guarantee a woman's fidelity during a husband's or lord's absence. Punitive applications targeted alleged adultery, disobedience, or immoral behavior. In harsher scenarios, the device was applied knowing it would cause permanent injury and infections. Physically, the belt was systematically degrading. Even without severe injury at first, constant contact with spikes caused irritation, abrasions, and ulcerations. Natural movements like walking, sitting, or bending became risky, as pressure and friction pushed spikes into the flesh. Over time, small wounds developed into deeper cuts, bleeding and oozing. Body heat, moisture, dirty clothing, and poor hygiene promoted bacterial growth. Local infections could escalate to cellulitis, abscesses, and sepsis, potentially life-threatening. Psychologically, the impact was equally devastating. The belt acted as a bodily condemnation, reminding the wearer of her plight with every movement. Pain was unpredictable and constant, and the sense of surveillance and immobilization was part of the punishment. Women subjected to this ordeal experienced extreme humiliation, chronic anxiety, loss of bodily autonomy, and social isolation. Many succumbed to despair, showing clear signs of depression, withdrawal, and in some cases, delirium from infection and deprivation. Technically, the belts varied greatly. Local artisans made improvised versions from steel strips, repurposed metal, and inward-pointing nails. In prominent feudal courts, more elaborate versions were crafted from worked metal with official locks, signaling authority and formality. Some had compartments for irritating substances like salt or pepper, intensifying suffering. In other cases, the lock bore the lord's insignia, transforming the belt into a symbol of ownership more than punishment. Historically, the widespread use of spiked chastity belts is complex and must be approached carefully. Popular narratives, later novels, and folklore often exaggerate their prevalence. Modern academic studies show many museum examples are late constructions, replicas, or misidentified objects. Yet there is documentary evidence of body restraints and punitive devices intentionally causing pain and preventing sexual contact. Thus, the spiked belt can be seen as both a real punitive instrument in certain contexts and an effective metaphor for extreme social control. Socially, the belt was a powerful symbolic weapon. It institutionalized the notion of ownership over bodies, particularly women's bodies, and turned sexual punishment into spectacle or domestic control. For authorities and husbands, the rationale might be honor preservation or preventing improper relations. In practice, however, it ensured submission, pain, and dependence, with consequences extending beyond sexuality to social stigmatization. A woman scarred, malodorous from untreated wounds, could be shunned and discredited. From a historical medical perspective, consequences multiplied. Chronic injury to genital mucosa or skin led to severe reproductive complications, including infertility, scarring-altering anatomy, chronic sexual pain, and future obstetric problems. Without antibiotics, deep infections could become fatal. Psychological damage had no adequate treatment. Survivors faced dual stigma: the violence endured and the absence of institutional recourse. Spiked belts were also instruments of intimidation in war, conquest, and slavery. Colonial lords, feudal captains, and traders used such devices to break the resistance of captured women, marking them as property and depriving them of agency. The device served a dual function: physical control and permanent social marking. Over centuries, reports of spiked chastity belts were employed in propaganda against enemies or cultural rivals, blurring the line between reality and exaggeration. Court chronicles, judicial records, and personal diaries provide some evidence of corporal punishments aimed at controlling sexuality, including tight bindings, restraint instruments, and rarely, devices intentionally injuring the genital area. With the Enlightenment and greater attention to individual rights, such practices were increasingly criticized and eventually abandoned. Legal reforms and changing social values, including protections for bodily integrity, contributed to their decline. Yet symbolic scars remained, and cultural imagination continued to associate chastity belts with control, domination, and institutionalized sexual violence. Today, when purported chastity belts appear in museums, historians caution rigorous evaluation. Many were Victorian-era curiosities, designed to shock visitors and reinforce moral narratives. Nevertheless, documentation of coercive devices that caused real injury provides grave lessons. The spiked chastity belt remains both a metaphor and testimony to how simple technologies can be perverted to inflict prolonged pain and consolidate hierarchies of power. In sum, the spiked chastity belt symbolizes the most brutal face of medieval moral control. An invention where the stated goal of protecting virtue became a pretext for systematic pain, mutilation, and social exclusion. It embodies the intersection of technology, power, and cruelty, and its memory demands historical and ethical vigilance regarding how societies regulate and, at times, violate the bodies they are meant to protect.